The case featured in this episode has been researched using police records, court documents, witness statements, and the news. Listener discretion is advised. All parties mentioned are innocent until proven guilty, and all opinions are my own. Hey everyone, my name is Nikki Young, and this is Serial Napper, the true crime podcast for naps. I'm back with another true crime story to lull you to sleep, or perhaps to give you nightmares. A few months before 74-year-old Leigh Ann Sabine died after battling brain cancer, she told her hairdresser that people were going to talk about her after she passed away because of the, quote, body in the bag. An alarming statement, but one that mostly went ignored as a wild, silly, made-up story, one of many that Leigh Ann was known for telling. But the true meaning of her words would be revealed about a month after her death, when two of her best friends made a gruesome discovery. It was well known that Leigh Ann had kept a fake medical skeleton, one that you might find on display at the doctor's office. She sometimes liked to place it in her garden, move it around her house, or keep it in her shed. She said that it was a keepsake from her nursing days, and her friends thought that it might be funny to use this medical skeleton as part of a prank. They were going to place it on one of their neighbors' doorsteps and then ring the doorbell to kind of give them a fright. They'd all have a laugh about it. Instead, they would be the ones frightened when they began to unwrap the medical skeleton and discover a perfectly mummified body. Now it was Leigh Ann who had the last laugh, as she had seemingly gotten away with murder. So, dim the lights, put your phone down, and listen to the story of Leigh Ann Sabine and the body that she had hidden in plain sight for 18 years under the guise of a fake plastic skeleton. So, let's jump right in. Leigh Ann Sabine was locally known as Mad Leigh. She was what we would call extra. She was flamboyant, she dressed for attention, and she always had the wildest of stories to tell anyone who would listen. She was also known to be downright selfish and evil, according to some who knew her. Maybe she was made this way because of her difficult beginnings. Born in Wales, she was abandoned by her mother as a young child, and she spent much of her early years hopping between the homes of her relatives and foster care. She was never shown love, and so she grew up not knowing how to love others. And so the cycle was repeated. She did, however, have her own ambitions, and she became a working nurse when she was in her late teens. At just 17 years old, while working at a hospital in London, she would meet her future husband, a 28-year-old man named John, who already had a wife and 2 children waiting for him at home. John worked as an accountant, and he was also a Korean War veteran, and he was absolutely smitten with Leigh Ann. She was incredibly confident for her age, and clearly John was kind of a predator, kind of a creep who liked young girls. It wasn't long into their love affair when Leigh Ann discovered that she was pregnant with John's baby. His wife, of course, found out, and she threw him out of the house. Then he was free to marry Leigh Ann in 1960. Leanne and John continued to grow their family over the next 5 years while living in southwest England. But then it was rumored that John had gotten himself into some financial troubles at work. It's alleged that he defrauded his company out of $6,000, which was a lot of money back then. One of their neighbors reported that they saw John burning papers in his garden, and the police believed that he was trying to destroy any evidence that connected him to the fraud. When he felt like the authorities were on to him, John, Leigh Ann, and their 5 children all fled to Auckland, New Zealand. They didn't stay there long before deciding in 1969 to take off to Australia, where Leigh Ann had decided that she wanted to pursue a music career. This time, they left their 5 children, ranging from 9 months old to 12 years old, behind at a state-run orphanage. They just abandoned them there with no explanation or reason. They didn't even bother to fill out any paperwork. They just left them. Their daughter, Jane, who was just 3 years old when her parents dropped her off and then vanished, she would later talk about all of the trauma she experienced in an interview with the NZ Herald. She said, quote, "I remember always, my brother and I, whenever we saw a taxi or an airplane walking home from school headed towards where we lived, we would run, thinking it was our parents coming to pick us up." That went on for years. Can you imagine a 3-year-old just suddenly one day having no mother, no father? I couldn't imagine my 3-year-old just suddenly one day asking, "Where's my mother? Where's my father?" and there being no one there. It was not easy for their children, who were basically bounced around between various foster homes and then back to being wards of the state. Because the government of New Zealand wanted to try to keep the 5 children together, they developed a program where this family home was built specifically for the kids to live, while foster parents were then rotated in and out of the home. Some foster parents were better than others, as you can imagine, and at times they suffered horrible abuse. All of this while Leigh Ann attempted to build her career as a cabaret singer. She wasn't very successful, so in 1972, she and John decided to return to New Zealand with new fake names, Leigh and John Martin. The authorities had been looking for them these past few years. They were facing charges of child abandonment, and the story of how they had just up and left their kids, it had been front page news at one point. So they kept a low profile, instead insisting that they were childless to anyone that they became friends with. They flat out denied that those 5 children belonged to them. It wasn't until a decade later, in 1984, that John and Leigh Ann decided to try to reach out to their children and reconcile. Now, I don't know how they thought this scenario was going to go. Maybe they had hoped that their near-grown children would welcome them back with open arms. But that wasn't the case. They had been severely traumatized, and they had questions about why their parents had abandoned them and where they had been all these years. Questions that John and Leigh Ann were not ready or willing to answer. 19-year-old Martin and 15-year-old Jane met with their parents in hopes of getting some kind of closure, but Leigh Ann's response that they had simply decided to move to Australia to pursue this music career, this cabaret career, it just didn't sit well with them. It obviously was not a good reason. It was selfish. Leigh Ann claimed that they had wanted to come back to New Zealand to get the kids as soon as she had made enough money, but that she just never did. It was a pathetic excuse, so Jane and the other kids, they decided to report Leigh Ann and John to the authorities. Plus, they tipped off the media to their whereabouts. Worried that they would soon be arrested, Leigh Ann and John, they took off once again, this time returning back to the UK. Eventually, in 1997, the couple would find themselves hiding in a small coal mining town called Bethai. After only a few short months of living in the South Wales community, John, who was now 67 years old, seemingly vanished. He had spent such a small amount of time living in this area that no one knew who he was or that he was ever even really there. If you were to ask people who John Sabine was, they had no idea. Leigh Ann began going by her middle name, Anne, and she quickly built herself a reputation. She would sometimes tell people that she had never been married or had children, which was an outright lie, or sometimes she'd say that she once had a husband, but he was abusive to her and her kids, and he was also a womanizer who decided to just up and leave her. No one really questioned her about her changing stories and contradictions. It was here, living in Bethai, that she would earn the nickname Mad Leigh. She was known around town for her theatrics. She'd befriended her neighbors and she'd tell them all about her days of being a nurse and a famous cabaret singer, which was definitely an embellishment. No one really knew when she was telling a wild tale or when she was being truthful, so they all kind of took what she was saying with a grain of salt. All they really knew was that this was a woman who loved attention, whether it be positive or negative. She wore fishnet stockings at the most inappropriate of times, and she covered the walls of her immaculately kept home in photos of herself, including one from her cabaret years when she felt like she was in her prime. Leigh Ann would sometimes have boyfriends, including one who lived with her for a brief time named Derek Ellis, who was a retired fireman. No one seemed to notice or care about her missing husband, John, or the fact that each month, his pension continued to be deposited into their joint bank account. John's name was still on most of the bills, but it was commonly accepted that this alleged abusive man must have just run off with some other woman, leaving poor Leigh Ann to pick up the pieces all on her own. In 2000, Interpol was able to track Leigh Ann down to let her know that her son Martin had taken his own life. Now, I'm not quite sure why, if they were able to finally find her, that they wouldn't continue to pursue those charges. Maybe it was because the children were now adults, so they didn't see the point in moving forward with child abandonment charges. I just don't know. But after learning that her son Martin had died, Leigh Ann decided that maybe it was time to reach back out to the kids, and she tried to contact her daughter, Jane. They had a brief conversation, and for the very first time, Leigh Ann told Jane that her father, John, was dead and that she had never loved him. Jane was already grieving the untimely death of her brother Martin, and she just didn't have time for her mother's drama. She didn't really take what she was saying seriously or even really want to deal with it, so she just kind of hung up on her. And that was the very last time that they would speak. Years later, Jane tried one last time to get some answers from her mother, but in turn, Leigh Ann sent her a very cold response. It was a card that featured a picture of a phoenix rising from the ashes, and on the back, it was a handwritten note that read, "Like the phoenix, I will arise from the ashes, and sleep will obey me and visit thee never. For my eyes are upon thee forever and ever. I have served my life sentence of shame and blame. Now is your turn to do the same. Signed, your nemesis, Anne Leigh Sabine." Imagine receiving a letter from your estranged mother who abandoned you as a kid, and she refers to herself as your nemesis. I mean, it's kind of true. She is pretty evil. She is kind of her daughter's nemesis, but how horrible to even admit such a thing. Even after all that time had passed, Leigh Ann was still trying to inflict pain upon her children. While she was horrible to her offspring, Leigh Ann was known to be very friendly, outgoing, and social to her neighbors. She would often invite friends over for a glass of wine, where she would recall stories about being a famous singer, a model in Australia, and all of her woes about her abusive womanizer husband, John, who had just up and left her. She also often talked about a plastic medical skeleton, like one that you would see in a doctor's office or in a science classroom, one that she had kept as a keepsake from her days as working as a nurse. Sometimes this skeleton sat in her garden, sometimes she would keep it in her home, and sometimes it was left in the shed. One of her best friends, a woman named Ryan Lee, would recall having a drink with Leigh Ann one day in her home when she mentioned the skeleton and how she had plans to move it to the attic. When Leigh Ann was questioned about why she was always going on about this fake medical skeleton like it was super important, Leigh Ann replied, quote, "All will be revealed, my darlings." An answer that disturbed Ryan. Still, she kind of just brushed it off. Leigh Ann was an odd character and would often say really strange, kind of off-the-wall things. And then around 2015, she was diagnosed with brain cancer, and her health began to deteriorate really quickly. The once dazzling and flamboyant Leigh Ann, who referred to everyone she met as darling, was now a shell of her former self. She knew that death was knocking on her door, and she had not achieved all of the things that she had wanted to. But that was okay, because she had one final big reveal that would only happen once she had passed away. Just a few months before the cancer took her, Leigh Ann Sabine allegedly told a hairdresser, quote, "People are going to talk about me after I have gone. I could be famous." And when the hairdresser asked her, why was that? She casually replied with, "Because of the body in the bag." Again, this was nervously laughed off by the hairdresser, who believed that she must have been being sarcastic or making a joke. Leigh Ann also had a caretaker near the end of her days named Lynn Williams, and she was adamant that the skeleton that she had kept in her shed needed to be moved to the attic prior to her death. Lynn joked that she hoped it wasn't an actual body, and Leanne responded with, "You never know," with a smile. No one really knew when she was joking or being serious, so again, this statement was brushed off. Leanne passed away at the end of October 2015 from brain cancer. Her children would never get the answers that they so desperately wanted to know regarding why their mother just abandoned them one day. She had taken those details to the grave with her, but she did have one final surprise to reveal. On November 24th, 2015, approximately 25 days after Leanne had died, two of her best friends, Ryan Lee and Michelle James, were sharing memories about her over a cup of coffee. One of them brought up Leanne's medical skeleton and how it was often a topic of discussion, and they thought, wouldn't it be funny to use this skeleton to play a prank? They'd bring it out and then they'd put it on one of their neighbors' doorsteps, ring the doorbell, and they would all have a good laugh. Leanne had requested that the skeleton be moved to her attic, but unfortunately, it hadn't been done before she had died. So it was left sitting under a plotting table in the communal garden, still wrapped up in plastic. So the two ladies, they went out to the garden and they found the skeleton and they began to cut through the layers of the plastic sheeting that was around the skeleton, when suddenly they were hit with the worst smell either of them had ever encountered. It was the smell of decomposition, and as the plastic was unwrapped, it revealed not a fake plastic skeleton, but a partially rotting dead body. They screamed, dropped the body, and ran to call the police about what they had just uncovered. When investigators responded, they confirmed that the fake skeleton was actually a near-perfectly preserved body. It had been chemically mummified by being wrapped in more than 40 layers of plastic, roofing felt, and shopping bags. The body had been so well preserved that they were able to determine whoever this man was had drank alcohol shortly before he died, but he would have been below the legal driving limit. The body appeared to be that of a white, middle-aged male who had a receding hairline. He was about 5'6" tall and wearing Marks & Spencer pajamas, and he had a gold signet ring on one of his fingers. When they searched their database for missing people in the area who matched this description, they found that there were none. They also compared the victim's DNA to those that they had in their system, and none came back as a match. The police had no idea who this murdered man could have been or how he became wrapped up in plastic and left in the garden. When an autopsy was conducted, the cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head, but they had no idea what the murder weapon could have been. There was none found at the scene. Though the police couldn't confirm the identity of the body just yet, rumors quickly began to swirl that it could actually be Leanne's husband, John. Over the years, Leanne had made many jokes about killing her husband and how that medical skeleton could actually be real, but everyone thought that she was just joking. Now, it didn't seem all that funny. Approximately 3 weeks after the body was discovered, there was a breakthrough in the case. A relative of John's came forward to provide the police with a DNA sample, and when a comparative analysis was done, it came back as a match. The skeleton in the garden was John Sabine. He had not run away with another woman, as Leanne had suggested. There was also no reason to think that he had been abusive towards her, as she had made everyone believe. There were no calls or reports of abuse filed with the police. When John's son Christopher from his previous marriage had learned what had happened to his father, he said, quote, "When I was told they had found my father's body, I couldn't believe it. I hadn't seen him for 27 years, and we didn't know if he was dead or alive. I tried to contact him many times, but he never replied. Now we know why." Christopher claimed that Leanne was an evil woman who lied her whole life. And I think many people would agree. Now that the mystery of John's whereabouts had been solved, the police wanted to figure out how he was killed. They obviously wouldn't know why. She had taken that with her to the grave, but they wanted to know what had happened in the moments before he died. But he had been hidden away for 18 years, so it wasn't going to be easy. Then they received a phone call from a woman named Valerie Chalkley, who had been friends with both Leanne and John back in the 90s. She had heard about the discovery of John's body, and she had quite the story to share with them. During a phone call with Leanne back in 1997, Valerie asked her if her and John were still together because she hadn't heard from either of them in so long, and she joked that she thought they may have killed each other by now. That's when Leanne surprised her with a response of, "It's funny you should ask. I have killed him. I hit him over the head with a stone frog which was at the side of the bed. He was just driving me mad. Every night he would get into bed crying and weeping, saying, 'You don't fancy me.'" But just as others had done in the past when Leanne had made a really strange remark, Valerie brushed it off as a joke, even though it's oddly specific. But now it was clear she hadn't been joking. What was this stone frog that she had mentioned, which she had kept at the side of her bed? Since Leanne had passed away, many of her belongings had been distributed to her friends or simply tossed away because she didn't have any known family members to give them to. Her kids probably didn't want any of her belongings. They just didn't want anything to do with her at all. Luckily, Leanne's friend Michelle had taken an interest in a heavy stone frog that she had seen sitting beside Leanne's bedside, and she had decided to take it home. The frog, which was now sitting in Michelle's living room, had a protruding eye and hind leg that lined up perfectly with John's fractures. Leanne had quite literally killed her husband by hitting him in the head with this stone frog, and then wrapping his body up tightly with over 40 layers of plastic and pretending like he was a fake skeleton from her nursing days. It was shocking to those who thought that they were her friends, but not to those who really knew how cold she could be, like her children. Leanne and John's son, now an adult and living in New Zealand, would say, quote, "My father was a good, soft-hearted man, but she was a conniving bitch. I could never forgive him for what he did, but I still believe he was manipulated and fell in love with an evil woman. That was his biggest crime." That's it for me tonight. If you want to reach out, you can find me on Facebook at Serial Napper. You can find my audio on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. I post all of my episodes in video format over on YouTube, so go check it out. And if you're watching on YouTube, I would love if you can give me a thumbs up and subscribe. I'm over on X, formerly known as Twitter, at serial_napper, and I post things on TikTok, Serial Napper Nick, and that's all one word. Until next time, sweet dreams, stay kind, especially in the comments. Bye.